All right. So last week we talked about React and we created a tiny little React project completely separated from our code base. And the reason we did that was just so that we can take very slow, nice little baby steps into React, right? We have 6 weeks for React. 6 weeks is kind of overkill to learn something you can learn in about, a 2-hour tutorial online. But we're going to take 6 weeks, take it nice and slow so you fully understand it. That being said, today we're actually going to we're going to create the React piece that's going to wind up inside our Node application today, but we're actually going to run it on its own. We're not going to run it with the Node app yet. Today we'll just run it on its own. Next week, we'll start embedding the CRUD operations, which means we'll need both servers running at the same time. But we'll talk about that then. For now, again, this will be just a little different than last week. But not a heck of a lot. We are going to introduce a new concept called routing in React. There's 2 different ways that you can actually approach routing in React. There's something called React Router, which is it's another NPM module that you can install that allows you to be able to create routes. But we're going to take the newer method, it's becoming more standardized, which is called Hook Router. It utilizes the new React hooks, which are becoming a bigger thing. Which kind of eliminates classes in React. So classes are starting to become a passe thing in React. And functional programming is becoming more of a common element in React. The reason why function programming wasn't embraced so much before is because you lost some capabilities with functional components. Functional components didn't have access to state, and they didn't have access to any of the lifecycle operations. But now that's changed with React hooks. We now have access to all of those, and it's actually a little simpler. I would say it's easier to learn, so we'll probably take that approach. Plus, it's going to be more common as we go forward. That being said, understanding class components, don't lose that, because you still need to understand what it looks like, because you'll see those in legacy stuff. All right, so what I would like you to do, if your current application you feel is not working or not functioning correctly, or maybe you just want to start from where we kind of finished off and you want a nice fresh version of it, there's the current version of our blog. You can download that. And what I would do is just take the files that are in there and copy them over into your current blog directory and just overwrite the files that are in there. Don't overwrite the .env. Keep your .env because you need that, because that's your connection details. But go ahead and do that if you want. And then that should make it nice and easy for you to connect with your Node stuff. Okay. That being said, we're not actually going to run the Node app today, so it's completely up to you. But at least it'll give you a fresh start. All right. Let's talk about some stuff. So the first piece we're going to do for the first little bit here, I think we're doing this, over the next 45 minutes, we're going to create a new React.js application inside our NodeJS application that we've been building for the last 7 weeks or so. We're just going to create the React app in there. We created exactly the same way we created the other one that we did last week. It's just create React app, except for we're going to call it client. And there's a few different ways that we can do this, because we can actually run our React app and our Node.js JS app in parallel, meaning that they can run on separated servers on totally different architectures, completely away from each other. Like, for example, you could have React in Heroku and the Node application on DigitalOcean or Amazon. They don't necessarily need to be in the same computer environment, so to speak, because they can run separately, entirely separate from each other, and then you just use API calls to the other one in order to access the data. That's one way. That's very common. The other way is the way that we're going to do, which is both of them run on the same machine, but they boot their own servers. So they will actually have their own servers running. That's the way we're going to do it. And then the last way is you have the Node.js application. When it boots up, it actually builds the React app, which creates the JavaScript files, and then the Node.js application just serves those React files. That is less common. You don't see that very often. So I feel like it's not really going to benefit you. The way we're going to do it, where we run both servers on the same machine, is probably the most common method. We use something called a proxy in order to proxy requests out to Node when the React app doesn't understand the request. But again, like I said, that'll be next week that we actually implement that. The first piece, though, we'll be implementing today, which is actually creating the client inside our Node application. So we're going to start out in our terminal. And you want to go and navigate to your actual project directory. Here, I'll just clear that so you can see. I'll give you a few seconds to get there and also copy over the files if you want to do that. That's up to you. Yeah, Mike. Oh, okay, yeah, that's possible too. So if you don't have the Create React App package, you're going to need to install it. You're going to need to install it at the global level. So the way you do that is npm install -g create react app. Now, stop before you actually go through with this. If you're on Windows, you need to make sure that your Windows PowerShell or command prompt is being run with administrator mode. Okay, has to be run in administrator mode because you need like root privileges in order to install Node modules at the global level. If you're on a Mac, you need to sudo this because you need root privileges to install this at the global level. Okay, so if you're on Mac, this would be sudo like that. And then you would enter in your password when it prompts you for it. If you're on Windows or in like command prompt or PowerShell, you're going to run PowerShell or command prompt with administrator privileges. You do that by going to the application, right-clicking, and choosing to run as administrator in Windows. All right. You don't need to do this if you already have the Create React app. So if you were here on on Thursday of last week, you don't need to do this at all. Or if you followed the videos or you did the tutorial through the notes. Okay?
Where did you say we can copy your files from?
From Blackboard. They're inside the weekly project folder.
Sorry,
Yeah, no worries. No, you just got here. Wasn't being mean. Wasn't being mean.
no, I'm just apologies.
Yeah. That's fine. All right. Did you install Create React? You were here last Thursday, so you definitely have it. Were you not here last Thursday?
Yes,
Yeah, so you should have Create React app. All right. So what we're going to do in order to create, once we have that package and it has installed, if you are in PowerShell or command prompt, you actually need to close your command shell or command prompt and reopen it because it's added new things to your paths, and you need to be able to reboot those paths, and that's how you do that. Incidentally, you can also use a command called source to do it, but it gets a little trickier. If you're in Mac, you know what, do the same. Just restart it. It would be easier. Now, if you don't have Yarn installed, yes, Gaga. You need to restart either your command prompt or PowerShell because you're on Windows, right? Yeah. So if you don't have Yarn, you will use npm. So there's two ways to start a React server. You can do yarn start or you can do npm start. In order to do yarn start, you need to have Yarn installed. My Monday class preferred to have Yarn because that way it was easier to follow along. So they all installed Yarn. Where they installed Yarn from is from, I believe it's Yarn. Hold on, let me just search it up. I think it's Yarn package. Yeah, it's yarnpackage.com. So it's yarnpkg.com. And it walks you through on how to install. You can do it through Homebrew. You can do it through Mac ports. This is obviously if you're on a Mac. The way we found, the easiest way we found was to use the curl command on the Mac. It seemed to work the easiest. In Windows, there's an actual installer. If you choose Windows, you just download the installer and then install it. And once again, once you install it, you will have to close PowerShell or command prompt and reopen it because it will add a new variable to your path. Okay? It's up to you if you want to install it. You can just use npm. Yeah?
When we download it, we can install it anywhere in the PC or in our
I would just let it do wherever it wants to go as its default. That's probably the easiest way to do it. I wouldn't change any of the options. Just let it install wherever it's going to install. Oh, Windows also has a package manager called Chocolatey. Never seen that before, but you can use Chocolatey, and then you get to use Choco install, which seems kind of cool. You would have to install Chocolatey, and then and then install Yarn. So you have to install the package manager to install the package manager. That's right. Which is kind of funny. All right, cool. Let's, just out of curiosity, show of hands, who's installing things and still going through that process? All right. You don't have to. You can if you want to. If you want to just use npm, then you're totally fine. Yeah. Like I would recommend just installing Yarn on your own time. You have npm right now, don't you? Okay, so then just follow along. So navigate to your blog. Make sure you're in your blog area. You got a few more seconds. I'll wait for Nira to sit down and actually get to that point. I don't want to lose anybody. I mean, we got time. It's a 40-minute class, and we've got 3 hours. So,
So what is the command to install React?
hold on, I'll find it. Nope. Whoa, hold on. It's npm. What do you want, a Mac? So it'll be sudo, not sludo, sudo npm install -g create React app will be your command.
Yeah, then once you actually try to create the app, it's going to install.
Exactly. So when you call create React app, it will actually go ahead and install whatever dependencies are necessary. It's a scaffolder, essentially. So a scaffolder, what those are is they basically will scaffold your application for you. They'll automatically create the directories you need. They usually create some test files for you so that you can go and look and see kind of how it's done. Incidentally, I was talking to Connor about Create React App, and he said he hasn't used it in over a year. He now just creates the directories, puts the necessary files in place, and goes. Because it is a bit of a babysitting tool. It will actually handhold for you, but once you start to learn, the different intricacies of React, you'll stop using it, and you'll just start rolling your own stuff, right? That being said, though, Rails has scaffolding tools, Laravel, a lot of different frameworks have scaffolding tools. Oh, okay, yeah. Scaffolding's super handy because it'll create a lot of the files for you. Some are really, really good, like the Rails ones are really good when you create a resource. So you know how we create a resource and then we have a controller, a model, and all of our views. When you do that in Rails, you just do create scaffold, or no, it's not. It's G scaffold, isn't it? It's generate scaffold. Generate scaffold and the name of your resource, and it will literally create your controller, create all 4 views you need, all 7 controller actions, and add a resource route to your router file for you, and create a model, and stub it out. All in one go. That's why you can get a Rails app up in about 20 minutes flat and operational because of that feature. So you can prototype stuff super fast.
So this command right here, like I do it in a different file path. Do I have to do it in the blog app file path too? Where my project is?
Not if you did -g, because then it will install at the global level.
Oh, okay.
If you didn't do -g, every time you create a new application, you'll have to do it. Otherwise, you won't have the package with you. We did -g for sure, yeah, because you don't want that anyways. You don't want all those create React file dependencies sitting inside your project folder because it's just a lot of bloat for no reason because you're never going to call it again. Once the React app is created, that's it, you're done, right? So you don't want those to be a part of your
And
package.
also, like for my blog application, I'm only missing the authentication. Is that going to be a big factor right now?
Not today.
Not today?
It will be next week, but not today.
So I should
Yeah.
get it up to date by next week.
Yeah, try to get it up to date by next week. Yeah. All right. Anybody still installing? No? Nur, are you with us now? Okay, cool. So our next step, once we have our React app, create React app library, I guess. Once you have that, make sure you've restarted your command prompt or terminal so that it's added to the path and everything is good. Let's go ahead and create a new React app. So make sure you're in your blog. If you hit ls or dir on Windows, you should see your app.js file, your controllers, your modules, all of that should be there, okay? Because that's where we want the client to exist. We want it to exist in the same folder structure at the root of our Node app, okay? Super important. What's that?
It's not written. It's LS or IS.
Not for you, it's dir.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're on Windows, it's dir. If you're in Mac, it's ls.
That must still work.
Oh, it should work in PowerShell. If you're in PowerShell, ls should work.
Yeah, Git bash works.
Git bash also should support ls, yeah. PowerShell supports ls, Git bash supports ls, and Fish supports ls if you're using Fish. If you're on Mac, I mean, it's Unix-based, so you're fine. All right, so as long as all those files and folders are there at the root, then you're fine. You can go ahead and do create dash react dash app space client. So what it is, create React app is the command, client is the parameter we're passing it. How many of you are taking Linux? A few of you? Have you created a shell script yet with arguments? Okay, you probably will. Hopefully you do. That's essentially what that is. It's a shell script with arguments. The argument would be client, right? So that's the name. We're going to hit enter. What's going to happen is it's going to go through. It's going to install all the necessary required packages. It's going to create new folders for us and scaffold our application. And we're going to wind up with a scaffolded application in the client folder. All in one go. I mean, it's kind of nice. It's fast. It does it on its own. You don't really need to do a lot for it. It creates all the necessary files for you and stuff like that. But like I said, it is hand-holding a little bit. But, you know, it's fine when you're learning. I don't do a lot of front-side stuff at work, so I use it whenever I have to. So I don't do a lot of front-end stuff. So once that's happened, if you are done installing, you can run npm start if you only have npm. If you have yarn, you can do yarn start. Sorry, actually, you need to cd into the client first. So cd client. At that directory, you're going to do yarn start or npm start. So if you do yarn start, once you hit enter, this thing's going to open your internet browser for you and go directly to the address. So there it goes, yarn run, version 1.6, development server, and bam, there it goes, localhost 3000, takes a couple seconds, and there we go, we can see our application. So if you see that, everything is hunky-dory and we're off to the races. We've got the first part of our project started and ready to go. I don't know what that is, just ignore that. That's just the folder. All right. And if you don't have yarn, don't run yarn start, run npm start. Same thing will occur though, by the way. Is anybody having any errors? Cool. Strange, but cool. Nice. Okay. I'm so excited. All right, go ahead and open up. We're going to go to open. We're not going to open the blog. We're going to open specifically just the client folder. That way we don't have a bunch of files kind of interfering with us. So just the client folder under the blog folder. That's the only one we're going to open. It doesn't really matter. It's just a little easier to work with this without a whole whack of extra stuff. I find people make more mistakes when there's extra folders there, especially when they have the same names, right? Mistakes happen. So this just kind of helps to avoid mistakes. So last week we talked a little bit about what these folders are. The public folder is where your static assets go. So these are the assets that will be served to your application. that, like, you can think of it like libraries. So maybe you have libraries from like third parties like Bootstrap or Lodash or something like that, and you want to load them, and you don't want to use npm for those things. You want to just serve them as static assets. That's where you would serve it from that public folder. The source folder is where we're going to be working primarily. This is where we're going to build our components and build our application. That's going to happen entirely in the source folder. Incidentally, I showed my layout to Connor, and he doesn't mind it. He wishes it was more encapsulated, but he said it's okay. It'll work for what we're doing. But just keep that in mind, though, that there's so many different approaches to how a React app will actually be laid out, and there's so many different opinions that you're going to unfortunately see a lot of that out there when you start doing your own Google searches and stuff like that. Just keep that in mind. So I kind of followed the way MDN suggested it. Connor does it more in an encapsulated way. I know Chris Naismith does it in a slightly different way as well. That's it. It's really dealer's choice at that point. It's however you prefer to do it, whatever you think. The big thing that I kind of feel with React is encapsulation is extremely important because a component should represent everything it requires in itself. I think maybe the MVC in me kind of forces it a little bit, which is probably bad, but either way, it works. All right. So that being said, we're going to set up our folders. I think the best thing to do is start with our public folder. So why don't we set it up first? The 3 files that are in there right now, the favicon, which is just that little spinny thing that they're doing on the front end, the index.html, which we're literally going to clear and paste in new code, and the manifest file, just leave those in place, okay? The manifest file, just so you're aware, basically it's responsible for defining your application. It basically describes your application, and it also helps to define resources and their expiries and stuff. Well, this one's not being used for that, but yeah, that's what it's for. All right, cool. We are going to add a new folder in here, and we're going to call it images. In the public folder, yeah. We will eventually likely move images and the other file we're going to create into our components and deliver them properly. But for today, just for simplicity, we're going to just put them in public, so they'll be served easier. We're also inside the public folder. We're going to create a new file called styles.css, and that's where our styles are going to go. I can zoom in a little bit because I think it's kind of hard to see. Yeah. So we'll have a styles.css and an images folder. So the 2 things I've highlighted there. Under public. Now it's probably just much easier under the source file, under the source folder, for us to just literally take from serviceworker.js up to app.css and go ahead and just delete those right out. We'll just create new files in there. Makes it a little simpler. So incidentally, React requires only 2 files to work. It requires an index.html file and an index.js file. The index.html file has to live under the public folder because it has to be publicly sourced. What happens is when the user navigates to the site, if it hasn't been built, when they navigate to the site, their entry point will be that index.html file. Okay? The index.js file, React uses that file to be able to deliver your React application. It's the entry point into the actual React app part. So all of your components and everything like that at some point need to be composed from that point of entry. What most people will do is they will use an index.js file and then serve their app.js file. Their app.js file will be their composition file that basically takes all of these wonderful little tiny components you've built and assembles them into one nice conglomerate, right? That's likely the approach, that is the approach we're going to take as well. So our index.js file is going to be very, very lean, but it doesn't stop everything from being handled the way it is. So right now, we're just going to set up that folder and what it looks like. So under the source folder, you're going to create one folder, one new folder called components. And that's where our components will live. And under the root, under that folder, you're going to create, under source, you're going to create a new file called index.js. So right now you should only have two things inside there, a components folder and an index.js file. So the index.js file is going to be the entry point into our React application components. It's what's going to serve them for us. Once you're done that, under the components folder, we're going to have two new folders and two new files. The folders under the components folder are going to be pages and partials. Pages will be our actual composed page. Partials will be little tiny components that we're reusing. Yes, sir.
Can I have more than 2,000 signs? I have
We deleted all those. That happened a little while ago. Yeah. Remove everything and then replace it with what we're doing. Okay, so we have pages and partials. The two files we're going to have under components are going to be @js, which will be our composition file, and router.js, which is where we're going to actually store our React routes. Now, routing in React works a little differently than routing in Node.js. The concept is fairly close to being the same. What is different is how the files actually get delivered to you, how the content gets delivered to you. Instead of a brand new request cycle, the request cycle happens inline, which means that's what gives us that whole single page application idea, because we're not navigating away from the page. We'll always just be rendering new content into the page reactively, hence the word React. That's where it comes from. So when you click, it reacts and does this thing. So when you click a link, it reacts and delivers different content. When you type your name, it reacts and submits that form. That's the whole idea behind React. All right. Maybe if you added like artificial intelligence, you could get it to be like proactive. And then we could change it to proact. Never mind. Stupid joke. Take it back. All right. New file. Now I got to edit the video. App.js and router.js. Those are inside our components. They're just our two files. So altogether, you will have 4 things in there. 2 folders, pages and partials, and 2 files, app.js and router.js. How come my what is different? Where are you looking? Oh, this little thing? That's Connor's doing. Connor installed this thing for me. I can't remember what it's called now. I forget. But he installed it. And basically what it does is it sticks little icons beside absolutely everything for me.
Yeah, no, it was the same, but like ours is like.
Oh, you've linked it up to something different. I'll show you. So we have router.js open right now. Do you have router.js open?
Yeah.
See down here at the bottom where it says what you're using as an interpreter? I've got JavaScript React. What do you have? You probably have Babel JavaScript. Change it to JavaScript React. Actually, I would go one step further. Click on it. Configure file association for .js. Type in React and change it to React so that it is always React. It will make your lives a lot easier. No, you only have to do it once. So now all JavaScript files will be associated with the React transpiler, which is fine. It won't mess up other regular vanilla JavaScript files. It just makes it so that it interprets JSX files properly. Yes, Goggle. Yes. No, can we just finish? We just have like 3 more files to add, and then you can go ahead and catch up entirely, because I'll leave it open. Okay. Under pages, we are going to add 3 files. We're going to add home.js, and you'll notice that these are the exact same files we did for our views, right? About.js and contact.js. I'm going to close this open editors thing so you can see, and the outline so you can see. Go. And then under partials, the last file we're creating is main underscore, wow, can't spell, main underscore nav.js. And that is it. Goggin would like to take a break to catch up. So why don't we take 10 minutes or so? That way everybody can kind of catch up to all this stuff and go get a coffee or something like that. And then the next bit is a lecture anyway, so we'll just power through the lecture. And then the last bit we'll just do. We'll take a break and then do the last bit. All right. So hopefully everybody has all of their files. So the files you should have is an images folder, the styles.css. You should have a components folder, pages folder, about.js, contact.js, home.js, partials, main underscore nav, app.js, router, and index.js. So how many is that? 5, 10, 12. So 12 different things. Okay? Before we actually go ahead and add code and everything else into these things, let's talk a little bit about the different aspects of React. So I have a small little lecture about it. Once the lecture's done, we'll take a small break, and then we'll actually port our views over from just the basic views, just the home, the contact, and the about us views over from our pug view files over into our new React application and make it so that they're served dynamically. Okay? So if you want to look at these notes and follow along, just go to the same, you can go to the link in Blackboard, it's right there. It's under that COMP-2068 Assistant Heroku app that I created a while ago. The lesson plan hard copy is number 8 that we're in. So I'll give you a second to load that up. And the thing we're going to start with is React.js overview. Is the part we're going to start at. So I'm going to kill this thing and save some battery power. There we go. All right, so when you think about like user interfaces in a website, it's funny because most users, when they look at a website, and anybody who does web development as a job can contest to this, users generally take the whole page in as a whole. They don't look at the page as individual little pieces, right? They look at the whole thing as one giant conglomerate. And a lot of new developers, when they start, they do that same thing, right? They take the page in as a whole. So if they want to add a navigation element to a page, they will add the same navigation element to multiple pages by just copying that code block and pasting it into, 3 or 4 pages. Same with footers and stuff like that. As you go through your career, you start to learn things like how to take those things and turn them into repeatables, right? Like partials or components or something like that. So you now encapsulate that little piece of information, that navigation, that header, or that footer, and then you start reusing those two parts, right? So that way, what's that? Like a template, exactly. You basically build this template, right? Like, for example, with the NodeJS thing, we were creating a layout where we just basically stick our content in the middle of it. React kind of does this on like steroids, like to a point of almost excessiveness. Most people that work in React will actually go right down to the point of a button. They will turn a button into a reusable component and then put that button wherever they need to actually utilize that. That way, if they ever adjust the style of the button to suit whatever brand they're currently working on, every single button across the whole application will change all at the same time, right? Same with like, you create a list, just a simple list, just an HTML list. But you've gone through and you've styled the list so it's really nice, right? And it doesn't necessarily use the same default bullet points. It actually uses like a branded bullet point. Or maybe it sets up each of the list items so they look like cards or something like that. You've gone through and created this thing, and now you want to be able to use it in other pieces and other locations in your application. That becomes this component, right? That now you can use in different places. But it can get even more granular than that. It can get to the point where the list itself is one component, and each list item is an individual new component. That way, in some areas, you can use card stuff, like like a card style as a list element. Other areas you can use bullet points, but they're still using the same list parent component. So React takes all of this and it turns it into these tiny little granular pieces. Now we are going to take more of a top level view, and our components are going to be a little bit more higher level. But that being said, the classic approach to React is get as granular as possible, because it means that you are encapsulating these concepts, encapsulating these little view pieces, and now you have the ability to reuse these wherever you want. We will be taking a look at something called styled components in the next couple of weeks, which is like a way to take CSS and turn it into a very functional, encapsulated idea, where you can actually style a button, go through all the processes of making the button have rounded corners, a certain font type for the text, a certain location for the actual text in there as well, transparencies, drop shadows, all that idea. And maybe you want to just make a different color. Instead of having to take all of those styles and duplicate them and then do that whole same process, you can actually just take the style component, extend the other one, and change the color in it. And it will create this whole brand new style component for you, but adopt from its parent styles. So we'll be looking at that in the future. So anyways, when you think about user interfaces, like I said, most people treat them as a whole, but now we're getting into the point of actually taking them as chunks, looking at what can be isolated as a reusable component. Always using that wonderful programmer's brain. Dry, be lazy, right? Do things once, not 90 times, right? That's what you should always be working for. Work yourself out of a job. That's your goal. How can I make the computer do my job for me, right? So with components, that gives you one step closer to, building something that can kind of solve its own problem. Components. When we build web interfaces, we usually have like multiple parts that make up a complete page, right? We'll have navigation, your sidebars, your footers, your headers. Maybe you have data feeds, right? From like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, right? Tabular data structures. Like tabular data shows up in tons of different sites. And each of these structures are often reused throughout the site. You may actually have, if it's like a big information site, you likely won't have one list. You'll have multiple lists, right? And you'll have them all over the place. And you may want to reuse these components in different places. React allows us to dry up our structures. Does anybody know what dry means? It's an acronym. Yeah. Exactly. Don't repeat yourself. That's the programmer's mantra. Keep it dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. It's also a soldier's mantra too. Keep your feet dry so you don't get gangrene. Not that you have to worry about gangrene on the front lines of development. But, all right. React allows us to dry up our structures by turning it into small encapsulated components, right? These are like little tiny modules. They're components that we can use to build a bigger solution. So the idea is you treat components almost like Lego blocks. You take one component and then you assemble it with another component and you slowly build out this big composed component, but it's just made up of these tiny little pieces, right? Components in React are meant to encapsulate everything a structure may need. So the component should actually contain everything it needs. It's HTML, it's JavaScript, and it's CSS. Ideally, a component should be so encapsulated that I can take the component from one application I've built, drop it into a new application that I'm building, and it should work. It should have everything it requires in order to work. Now, obviously, that's a Goldilocks idea because sometimes information might not be available. I may not have data available to it. But for the most part, the basics of a component should be able to be self-encapsulated, and it should be able to be put into any other application. Right, so components that we learned last week, we talked about components. And I'm going to zoom in a bit so you can see this. The components we built last week, they come in two flavors, right? We have functional components and class components. Functional components are the ones that we're actually going to be using 90% of the time, maybe almost 100% of the time. I don't think we'll build another class component going forward because they're not going to be deprecated, but React is starting to move away from them for functional programming reasons. JavaScript has always been considered a functional programming language, so obviously the purity of JavaScript is programming functionally and not programming with things like classes. So functional components are the simplest way to define a component. they're just a JavaScript function. That's all they are. It's just a regular function. So if you know how to program a function in JavaScript, congratulations, you can program a functional component. The only thing that you need to remember with a functional component is that it has to return something. Has to. It can return another component. It can return some HTML, but it has to return something. It has no choice. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It'll blow up. The reason why we had class components was because functional components didn't support some aspects of React, like state. So you couldn't maintain state. So if you needed to actually have state pass through your application, you couldn't do that because the functional components couldn't support it. So you had to make sure you had these class components that did. And you couldn't support something called component lifecycles, which we'll be taking a look at closer next week. Component lifecycles are basically a component has multiple points where it hits different states. For example, when it first gets mounted into your application, when it first updates, and then when it becomes unmounted. Those are 3 spots that you can tap into and perform operations at those stops. You can kind of think of them like you guys have done class programming, right? You did it in JavaScript. So you can think of constructors, right? Which is when the class gets instantiated. You can think of copy constructors. So like if you make a duplicate of your class, it will call the copy constructor. And if you destroy the class, it calls the destructor, right? So those are lifecycle states of your class. And React supports that as well with component lifecycle states. They suggest embracing both, though, and have it made it clear that classes won't be removed. So they're not removing classes. They don't want you to run out to your current React apps that you have published and rip all the classes out of them and replace them with hooks. They want you to stay with what you've got, but what they do recommend is that as you're approaching into new React applications, that you embrace hooks and use hooks. All right. This is a functional component example. It kind of demonstrates the required pieces. You need to import React, right? Obviously, you're building a React app. If you don't have the React library, it's not very much a React app. So in order to have the functional components work, we have to import React from React. We just create a regular function, but we can return this raw HTML you see here. We're completely capable of doing that. Just return this raw HTML. That HTML, this is one of the things that I will say confuses most students when they first start with React. Once you are in the world of HTML, you are in the world of HTML. If you need to perform any inline JavaScript, you can't just jam a variable in here. It won't support that. You have to do something called string interpolation, and that's where we just add curly braces around whatever our variable name or whatever our expression is, and we can actually parse the expression inline in there. It gets confusing because you're like, well, I'm already in JavaScript. So why now do I need to escape JavaScript, right? So it can be a little bit odd. You just need to understand that once you have something between a set of tags, you are now in the realm of HTML. And then the last thing you need to do is export your component so it can be imported somewhere else, usually in whatever composition file you're building. So for today, for example, we'll be using app.js. App.js will be our composition file. We will need to make sure that we can import our home, for example, and our about component and our contact component. Class components are often used to encapsulate more complex interactive components. These allow us to maintain state throughout our component and implement life cycles and operations during their lifespan. Kind of what I was already talking about. Basically, the idea is that a class is the way it used to work in React is class gave you access to a state variable and it gave you access to component lifecycle hooks that you could actually tap into. Now that's not the case. You can use React hooks in order to do the same thing. One thing to note about classes in JavaScript, they were to appease Java programmers and C++ programmers and people who work in class-based languages. That's all they were for. They are syntactic sugar for JavaScript prototypes, right? Because JavaScript is a prototypal language. That means that when you write a class, it's actually kind of inefficient because what you have to do, what the transpiler has to do, is it has to take this wonderful class, convert it into JavaScript, and then from JavaScript into machine language. So now it's got 2 steps instead of 1 direct step. That may change. There is talks about in the next transpiler that these will actually go straight to C classes. So straight from here to C classes and not through the prototype part. Which that means these will become a lot faster, like really fast. And it'll be negligible between those and using prototypes, and it'll be definitely up to you. But one thing I will suggest, purists, JavaScript purists, believe that JavaScript is a functional programming language, which means stay away from classes. They want you to program functionally. Composition over inheritance is their key mantra, which is build the things you need, not just take the whole damn tree, jungle, and monkey with you everywhere you go. That's the idea. All right, props and state. Probably the most important part about React. Props are our way for taking data, dynamic data, and giving it to our components. State is something we define inside the component, and we can update it within our code. Props you give to the component, and we do that by giving it through the attributes. This is another one that kind of is a little confusing, but it's not really. It's actually quite simple. See these wonderful things? You guys have done these before in HTML, right? You've created attributes. Whenever you create an anchor tag, you need a href, other words, it doesn't go anywhere. Whenever you create an image tag, you need a source, other words, it doesn't have any rendered image. You get that broken tag, or it shows the alt tag. The alt tag, right? The alternative text tag, so that if the image is broken, it actually gives you some sort of information about what's in there. Or IDs, right? IDs are fantastic. They help you to be able to navigate around the DOM super fast. Names, required if you're going to send form information off to your server. You need names. You can't not have them. Those are all known as HTML attributes. Those attributes actually get turned into properties of the component. And what happens is when it calls this function, it takes name and age and adds them as properties on whatever argument you put into there. So if you have props, and you want to access name, you can access it by just doing props.name, because it now becomes a property of it. Or you can do props.age, because that's now a property of it. Same if we provided an anchor tag, we could access the href if we wanted to, by just doing props.href, right? So you can actually create your own HTML attributes, and they become props, properties, short for properties, that you can now pass to your component. So here's another props example. If you're using classes, this is how props works. When the class is created, if you don't create a constructor, when the class is created, React automatically creates a new property on the this called props. And it works, otherwise it works exactly the same way. It still takes these attributes and assigns them to this variable. Just you don't get to call it whatever you want. It's already predefined for you. If you want to change this name, you have to write your own constructor, and then you can call it whatever you want. All right. So state works quite differently than props. Props are passed to the component, right, through when you instantiate the component. Whereas state is actually defined by the component itself. So when the function gets invoked, whatever state is inside there, it will be set. One other thing that I should actually edit this and let you know, state is forever. It's maintained through the life cycle of the application, or until the component becomes destroyed or unmounted. State will actually persist, which is awesome. So say you switch from the home page to the about page and you've changed state. In our Node application, kiss it goodbye, because there is no state on the front end, right? It just doesn't exist. But in React, because there's no actual brand new request and we're not moving anywhere in reality, state is still defined and will maintain its piece. I understand that you don't fully understand that currently, and that's totally okay, because as we build through with the CRUD system, you're going to learn to appreciate state and the fact that it maintains itself, so that when it doesn't matter if you shift pages or whatever, it will always just remain the way it is. Okay. State used to be explicitly owned by class components, but now React hooks actually allows us to be able to manage state. So this is an example of what a class component would look like with state. So in our constructor, we define a new state object, and we provide our details. So state still works the same way with hooks. We have to give it a predefined starting value. Even if it's just null or undefined, they have to be defined by something. You have to give it something, right? So we can actually give it whatever the starting value are of the props. So I'm actually just taking the props and I'm starting my state out with those prop values so that it has something to begin its life cycle with. Okay. So in our state example with functions, it works a little bit different. When we import React, we also have to import the useState module at the same time. Once we have that, we can go ahead and do the same thing. I would say this is a little easier to understand because it's more definitive. Basically, the way it works is we set the name that we want to use for our variable for state so that we can access it, and we create an update method, a setter. You know what setters are, right? Setters and getters. We create a setter. UseState is a function call. So here's how this works for those that don't understand this JavaScript, this little bit of JavaScript. This is slightly confusing. Does anybody know what this structure is called? It starts with a D. Yeah, it's destructuring. So what this is UseState is going to return an array of values back. We can actually use destructuring to set two variables. We can set the first value that gets returned back into a variable called name, and the second value into a variable called setName. What UseState is actually going to return is this is our initial starting value. Name will be set with that initial starting value. SetName will be a callback function, will be a function definition that gets passed back from UseState. Okay? What that means is that whenever we want to actually change the value of name, we will call setName and pass it whatever we want the new value to be. It is important to use setName and setAge and not just directly call name equals some new value. The reason why that is important is because React will actually do a whole bunch of other things when you call that. It will go through and update any components that are currently using those values. So if I change my name from Sean to Steve, for example, it's going to go through the whole application, and every reference to Sean that is using that variable, it's going to replace them with Steve immediately, reactively, right? That's the whole idea. We want it to happen reactively. You'll see that as we go along with the CRUD system. You'll start to see and appreciate how that works. All right. Hooks are functions that let you perform logic at certain points in a component's lifecycle. Hooks only work in functions, just like this .state only works in classes. So you can't use hooks in the classes, and you can't use this .state or component lifecycle actions in functions. You have to use hooks in functions. You can build your own custom hooks as well, which some of you may take advantage of, as well as use several built-in hooks. There's tons of them. We'll be using hooks in the future so we can become familiar with them. All right. Any questions about hooks or anything like that? It's one of those things that we're just going to use, and slowly you'll start to understand them, and we'll talk about them in depth over time. But I don't want to overload your brain, right? So let's take it slow. React.js production build. So React can be run in two ways. It can be run unbuilt, which some people will do. I don't recommend that. I recommend running it built. And you can run it built. What that basically means is when we run it unbuilt, that's where we can see the source files, and we can see all our components and all of our node modules and our libraries and everything else, right? Built, what happens is it takes all of that information, it compresses it down into two files, an index.html file and it'll be a few files. It'll be index.html, and it'll be a big compressed JavaScript file that's been gzipped and uglified and everything like that. And then you'll have your assets, your static assets. The reason it does that is because it actually goes through the node modules, figures out which ones you're using, figures out which ones you're not, and it only loads in what you require. And what you wind up with is a super optimized, efficient version of your application when you're done. And then that gets delivered to the front end. So we will be talking about production build when we get to that point. We will likely not deploy to Heroku until probably about 2 weeks from now, 2 to 3 weeks from now. Okay, just to warn you. Mostly because we don't want to publish anything sensitive, and not to mention the actual deploy process is a little tricky, and I want to actually dedicate a class to doing deploy for it. So we'll probably do that after our CRUD, which will happen over the next 2 weeks, starting next week. All right, cool. Kind of information overload a little bit. So we'll take a small break. We'll take 10 minutes. And then after that, we'll build out the rest of our application. Is this our application here? Yeah, we'll build out the rest of our application. And then that'll be it. We might end a little early. Nice. All right. And we're going to try to do this kind of fast. So go ahead and make sure you have your IDE open. And don't worry about any files open right now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how our application is going to flow. Basically, the idea is that the user, when they access our React application, they enter inside this index.html file. That's the first file they hit. Just like when you go to, like you guys did HTML, right? You did an HTML class.
Yes.
You created, I'm sure you guys created an index.html, and hopefully your HTML teacher explained to you that when you navigate to that directory with that index.html in it, you don't need to put /index.html. The browser will automatically assume that's what you're looking for. It looks for that file, it looks for a .html, looks for a .php, and I think it looks for another one too, phtml. There's a few default ones that it will look for automatically. So what will happen is when somebody navigates to our website is going to deliver this file. Okay? Then what's going to happen? Our JavaScript is going to load. We're going to wind up with all of our JavaScript loading from React, from the server. And it's all going to publish itself inside this div. So this is where something you might have heard of before, server-side rendering. Just out of curiosity, show of hands of how many of you have heard server-side rendering before? Okay, so what server-side rendering is and why it's needed, React applications and Angular applications, Ember, Backbone, these applications, they render all the content using JavaScript, which means JavaScript needs to be active on the page. Once JavaScript is detected by the browser, it will parse the JavaScript and execute whatever the JavaScript code is, and any content being delivered will be delivered out to the page. The problem with that is that when bots are crawling through the internet, they don't generally wait for JavaScript to load. What they will do instead is capture the page currently the way it is and move on. Most people don't care about that unless you're actually trying to rank your page on Google. Because when Google's bot hits the page and doesn't see any content, it flags it as an empty page and moves on. That used to be the case. JavaScript now, because it's so commonplace, Google will wait for JavaScript and actually render the page. However, it will only wait so long. If your page takes too long to render, it will move on, right? So what people do is they try to embed something called SSR, which is server-side rendering. And basically the idea is that your content gets delivered by the server, so that at least there's content there for the bot, and then JavaScript will replace the content with the dynamic content. That's usually what happens, in a nutshell. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's basically what happens. That being said, SSR is becoming less of an issue. It's becoming almost a moot issue because JavaScript is getting better at being able to detect it. And Google has Lighthouse now, which they rely on for actually ranking pages. And Lighthouse is totally single-page application friendly. They want you to build these things, right? So Lighthouse will actually rank your page for, your JavaScript is fast, your content is fast, and stuff like that. And they want you to use JavaScript more. That's the whole idea. But just keep that in mind that SSR is a thing. You might work for a company on your co-ops that says, hey, we need you to build SSR for our React app. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about server-side rendering. All right, we are actually going to change this index page because this index page is not our index page that we want to deliver. We want to deliver something else. And no, we're not going to type it out by hand because it's a ridiculous amount of HTML. And you already know HTML, and I don't need to teach you new HTML, I don't think. That's my opinion. So if you go to our actual lesson plan builder and you scroll down a little bit, you'll see index.html. You can even do Command F or Control F and type in public/index.html and hit enter till you get to this spot. You're going to copy the code in this block. Yep. That's a good idea, actually. I should add a copy button. I should do one better. I should just make it so that when you click in here, it just instantly copies. Yeah. And then tells you this was Mo's copy button. Yeah. Mo was here, 2019. There we go. I'm going to paste that into this index.html, and I'm going to save. So this is going to give us our viewport stuff, load our manifest file, stuff like that. But the most important pieces are the bootstrap, right? So now we have bootstrap in there. Our style sheet. This is going to come from our public directory. Our blogging project title, which we will eventually dynamify, whatever. Make it dynamic. And then our script tags that we require, so our jQuery stuff and more bootstrap stuff. Okay, so just basically gives us our bootstrap stuff that we had before. You'll notice I didn't take out this. This remains here because that's where our components are going to wind up getting rendered. They're going to wind up getting rendered right in that location. I also don't add any styling around it. I don't add any like pre-navigation. I try to keep this as little as HTML as possible. I almost want no HTML in there, right? Because I want to be able to put things in there and not have them affected by the page, right? I just want to be able to shove my content in there and not have to worry about predefined margins and all the rest of that, okay? All right, so let's talk about the application flow a little bit. So when our user enters our application, they're going to hit this page. Then this is going to deliver them to the React framework. Well, that's not entirely true. This will deliver the React framework. It will load it into that root thing. So basically the idea is that they hit the index page. Index.js gets loaded into that. Index.js is going to make a request to our component app or app.js file, which is going to be the composition of all of our components. And for example, the main nav is going to be a part of that file, and the home will be a part of that file. So when we're done, we will have an index page, an index.js page, the app.js, the main nav, and the home page. Actually, we'll have all three of our pages, and they will all get delivered to that spot. All right. Let's talk about Jsx Fundamentals. So we did a little bit of JSX last week. It's not very difficult. I think some people take it more complex than it is, but we'll do it in nice little chunks so you can see the dependencies kind of separated out and it'll be a little easier to understand. But the idea is that there's three fundamental pieces to creating a component. You have to import the React library. You have to create a class or functional component, some sort of component, and you have to export that component. So you need to do those three steps in order to create a component. So let's open up home.js. Seems like a strange spot to start, but that's where we're going to start. I'm sure I had a reason, but I don't remember what it was. Dementia. It sinks in when you get old. All right. We're going to import. Nope, not over there. We're not. We're going to import in here. Import React from React. What that's doing is that's no different than when we did the require. Remember when we were doing require in Node.js and you would write things like, well, let's write that if we were doing it in Node.js. It would be const React equals require React. That's the equivalence to what we just wrote above. These mean the same thing. Essentially what it is, you're creating a variable called React. You don't have to create a variable called React. You create a variable called Ron if you wanted to. That is totally fine. You want to call it Ron? You can call it Ron. It doesn't matter because what's happening is the React library has a module exports and it's exporting out whatever the library is there. So you're just literally importing the library into a variable so you have a way to reference it, right? So it's exactly the same idea. Let's get rid of that const require because we don't have access to that. The next step is we need to create a function for our component. So we create a function. Just like any function, we're going to give our function a name. It's not an anonymous function. So we're going to call our function home. Give it a set of parentheses for any arguments or parameters that we want, and a set of curly braces. Okay. And then the last step is to export it. So we're going to export defaults home. And I'll have to look up what the default part means. I can't remember why we do default, but that's how we export out the component. I think default just means that it's not a specific module inside the component is what it is. It's the whole thing. Yeah, it's just the whole thing. Because I think you can actually export specific elements of something. It's kind of a way to keep some things private and some things public and things like that, if I remember that correctly. All right. Now we want to actually, so those are the three things we need. The next step we want to do is actually create the logic inside our actual component. So let's do that. This component is going to be very simple. You can have logic, like you can do console.log, welcome home. That's totally fine, right? And it supports that because it's just a function call. But components all have to do something. What do they all have to do? They have to return. They have to return. We have no choice. So we're going to return some HTML, and we're going to encapsulate that HTML in a set of parentheses. Notice the space between return and these parentheses. Return is not a function call. Return is just return. This is just a set of parentheses to encapsulate our HTML. That's all it's for. A lot of what you will see is people put them like this so that it's on another line, and then they write their HTML in the middle so it's nicely nested, because it looks nice when you have nested statements. Lelit. Yeah. Yeah, definitely do that, because it looks nicer. It's cleaner. So we're going to return a header. We're going to return header. This is just basically the same code we had in our pug file. We're going to add a CSS class, but it's important to understand we can't call it class because class is a keyword in JavaScript. So we have to call it class name instead of class. We're going to say it's equal to home-cta and close it. That's just what we called it. We just called it, that's just the class name we gave it, home-cta. That's a CSS style class, right? So just like you create any style class inside HTML, that's all that is, and we just called that home-cta. CTA actually stands for call to action. Yeah, usually. We're going to create an H1. And then in here we're going to write the adventure, unless you want to change it up, totally up to you, of a lifetime. We're going to add a nice little self-closing break tag. It's important it self-closes. Small. And we originally had it was a rainy day in Pizza Bell. There we go. And that is our homepage component. Now this component's kind of boring because we don't really have a lot of content on it. But keep in mind that when we actually build out the CRUD operation ones, they have a lot of content. And they have several pieces that we can put together, like our form can become a component all on its own, right? And that form will get embedded in the regular new page and the edit page. And we can even make the headers components and stuff like that. So we can break these down into tiny little pieces, which we will. Incidentally, this weekend I have to write 2 lesson plans because I'm going camping the following weekend. So 2 lesson plans will be posted live for this week. So I'll teach both, one in each week. You'll just have access to them early. Okay, cool. Anybody still typing? No? All right, awesome. The next piece we need to do is complete that index.js file, because if we don't, we won't be able to go from index.html to index.js, right? Right now, index.js is empty. If you open it, it has nothing in it. Index.js is still rendering or still doing something with a component. The only difference between it's not exporting the component, it's actually going to render the component directly from that location. So we still need to import, why do I always do that? Still need to import React from React. But we also need to import the React DOM from the library React-DOM. What that's going to do is it's going to take our React component and render it into our HTML page for us and make life nice and easy for us. And we're only going to do this temporarily. We're going to put our home page here. We're going to import our home page from our /components/pages/home. Kind of a lengthy statement. Zoom in a little bit because I think that's a bit hard to see. I like this projector because the lettering is much larger in this room than it is in other rooms, and I usually have to zoom in, then I lose so much real estate on my screen. And then the last statement that we need to do is just do our render. And the render takes 2 arguments. It takes a component that you want to render, and it takes where you want to render it. So the component we're going to render, React DOM .render is the function call. The first argument, we're going to render home. And the way you do that is you put an angle bracket and make it self-closing. That's what it looks like when you render it. And then next, we need to give it a DOM node of where we want to render it. So we're going to do document.querySelector. You'll probably remember that from last semester. And we're going to render it at #root, that div with the ID root that's on our index.html page. We have one more thing we need to do. We have a background image in our Node.js app that we need to now copy and put into our React app so we can actually load that image because we currently don't have access to it. So we need to do that. So I'll give you a few seconds to finish typing that out, and then we'll go copy it. All right. Anybody still typing? No? Okay. Open up your File Explorer. Navigate to your project folder where this project currently is located. You want to go to the blog version of it. In the blog, you'll see your assets folder. Go to your assets folder. From assets, go to images, and you'll see your background.jpg. Hit Command-C or Control-C or right-click and choose copy so that you can copy that image. Navigate into that client folder. Go to Public. Go to Images. And paste it. Okay? So you're going to your blog folder, to your assets, to your images, and copying the background.jpg. Then you're going into our client folder, public, images, and pasting it. So that way it's in there. Once we're done that, go to your terminal. If you already have React running, that's fine. If you don't, you'll need to run npm start or you'll need to run yarn start, right? Whatever one you have. It's going to boot up. It's going to open up the browser. And you should get the adventure of a lifetime. It was a rainy day in Pizzaville. Not sure why our image isn't loading, but we can find out easily. What's that? Oh, right, we didn't load in the styles yet. Why didn't we load in the styles yet? Oh, yeah, we didn't actually add the styles to the page. So let's do that now. If you go to the lesson plan builder, there's the styles. Public/styles.css. Go ahead and copy those from the lesson plan. See? And then open your styles.css file and paste them in place and save it. And it will update in your browser automatically. You can find those in the lesson plan. Don't try to type them out because I'm definitely not waiting for that. It's too much. No. Go to the lesson plan. Copy the CS. I need something to throw just for you. When I was in grade 8, I had this very angry grade 8 teacher, and it was a different time. He would grab chalk brushes, and if you got caught talking, he would huff chalk brushes across the room at you. Yeah. He was an angry guy. He was so angry. Yes. In the next.js file? What next.js file? Oh, index.js. I will show you my index.js file, and then you can see if maybe yours is different. Why? It's the same. I want to see the error, and I want you to brighten your screen because I can't see it from here. Thank you. Okay, so the reason that is because it's trying to access components home. If you hover over it, I bet you it says it can't find this thing. React must be in scope when using JSX. Oh, you didn't capitalize React. It's your common issue. You should always just look at letter case before even asking anything. I'm just teasing. All right, if you go to your browser, everything should be hunky-dory, and you should see the same thing. Yes, Fafana. You don't actually have your image? Oh, did you add the styles in and save? So you went to styles.css and you saved that? In the public folder. And it's styles with an S. .css. And you copied your image into public images, and it says background.jpg. Okay. Yeah, that's just it being stupid. Yeah, that's totally fine. That shouldn't be an issue. Make sure your styles.css doesn't have any broken CSS. Make sure you didn't forget to copy the bottom curly brace. Out of curiosity, how many are working? And they actually see the adventures. Yeah, so it's definitely a you thing. Not a big deal. As long as you got something, we can move forward and actually fix that after. So we'll fix that right after. Okay, so our next piece that we're actually going to do is add our about page and our contact page. And these pages are extremely simple because they're very, very small. So just open up your about.js and let's see how well you've been listening. What is the first piece I need for my component? That's right. Import React from the React module. Thank you. What is the second piece I need? No, not import React DOM, the function, the actual functional component. Doesn't have to be a function, it can be a class, but we're using the functional component style. The functional component requires one thing, a return statement. And we're only going to return a simple H1 for now, just to make life a little easy. You know what? I'm going to make that a lab. I'm going to make that a lab. It will work without the
I
brackets.
mean, if it's like a single line.
Yes, it will work. They're always single line, anyways. The reason why we don't generally do that is if you want to actually do it across multiple lines, they have to go into parentheses. You have no choice. But yeah, you can do it if it's a single line. That's fine. You can't do this. It'll break.
Oh, really?
Yep.
So this would work?
Nope, that will work because you have the parentheses. If you didn't have the parentheses, it would break.
Oh, okay, I see. That's okay.
And the last piece we need for a component, the third step. Export, that's right. Export default a boutie. Why does it literally changed what I just wrote? Don't autocorrect my stuff. Type in about and it kept changing it to is absolute, is absolute. It's telling me something. It's telling me it is absolute. All right, the contact page, don't look exactly the same. So why don't we just be lazy programmers? Command A, Command C, or Control A, Control C. Open up the contact.js page, and Command V or Control V. And then go ahead and change the word about. I'm not sure if you remember how to select all of the abouts, but you can select all three abouts at the same time and just change those out to the word contact. If you're on a Mac, it's Command D. If you're in Windows, I believe it's Alt D or something like that. Is it Control D? Control D. Or you can just type it out. I know you did. I absolutely know you did. No mystery with you. Yeah.
That's not good.
All right. We now have 3 components in total, but we can only actually access 1. We're going to create something to actually create routes for us so that we can navigate to the other components and visually see their differences. So in order to allow our user to navigate, we're obviously going to need a menu. We have a menu currently on the Node.js side, but we need to actually port that over to our React side. The library we're going to use to handle our routes in Node is Express. That's the thing that does all of our routing for us. Inside our React side, we actually have 2 options. Actually, there's tons of options, but we have 2 options that are generally used. There's React Router, which has been maintained and supported for quite a while, but requires quite a convoluted set of stuff in order to get it up and running. And then there's Hook Router, and Hook Router is actually quite simple. I also like how it abstracts certain pieces away from each other so that there's a little bit more control over what you're doing. You still have the ability to do alias routes if you want to point to the same content, stuff like that. Basically the same kind of capabilities we have in Node, you can now have on the front end of React, which is really convenient. So in order to use these, the first thing we're going to need to do is actually create the React router file, or the router.js file. Give me 1 second. All right. Close. It took a little bit of liberty with time. Go ahead and open up your router.js file. We may separate concerns at some point where our resources will be separated into separated files, just like we did on the Node side, but for now we'll just put everything under router.js. I haven't decided whether I'm going to do that or not. All right, so we're going to have import React from React. I'm actually not 100% sure I even need that. I followed a tutorial for this part because I was new to Hook Router, and I feel like I don't need that piece. I'm just going to keep it there for now. We need to import our 3 page components because we're going to link to our 3 page components. So we need to import the home, whoops, with a capital H, not a lowercase h, from. And our paths are always relative to where we currently are, and because we're in the components directory, we're going to go ./pages/home, because we're already in the components directory. Then we're going to be lazy little programmers and duplicate that 3 times. Change the next statement from about to, or from home to about. Make sure you watch your case. Don't accidentally use uppercase when it's lowercase and lowercase when it's uppercase. It's actually as much as we make poke fun, it's happens to almost all of you. So yeah. After we're done that, we're going to create a routes object. And what our routes object is going to be is basically a key, which will be the path to wherever the user is going. Think of the paths that we created before in Express. Same idea. It's going to be a path, and that's going to point to a function, a callback function, that's going to return a component. Almost exactly the same thing we did in Express, with a path that pointed to a controller action. Same idea. So let's just draw it up. You'll see what I mean. So const routes is equal to an empty object. Let's do that step first. Once you're done that, go ahead and put your cursor in the center there. And let's create our first path. So quote characters to store our path. And we're going to put the home route in there right now. So the root route. Add our colon because it's a key. And we're going to point it to a nice arrow function that's going to return the home component. The syntax, I will admit, looks a bit bizarre, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, if it's better for you to wrap these in curly braces like that and write return home because that makes more sense and is more verbose, you can go ahead and do that. I can fully appreciate why you would want to do that because it does read a little better. That's up to you. Otherwise, you can take advantage of the shorthand and just do that. Let's add another route. We're going to add the about route now. So it'll be slash about colon callback function. Whoops, callback function, and it's going to point to the about component this time. All right, Mo. You feeling lucky, punk? Do you want to try the next one?
It's going to be colon slash.
Okay, walk me through it. What's my first piece of syntax I need here?
Colon,
Quotes.
yeah.
All right. Bunny ears. Got them.
Yeah. Slash.
Slash.
Contact.
All right.
And then colon.
Right.
Set of parentheses.
Yep.
Arrow function.
Yep.
And then open tag. Contact with a capital C.
Yep.
And then close it.
Nice. Almost done. Does anybody want to take a random guess at what the last line of this needs to be? Awesome. Good job. Export default routes. So that's going to export the routes. Now this is not hook router. This is just something hook router is going to need to be able to actually create the routes for us. This is just a nice plain object that we're exporting in. This tablet has serious issues with battery life. All right. Now we're going to create the navigation because we're going to need it. But before we do that, we're going to have to install a new module. We're going to need to install hook router. If we were to use React Router, we'd have to install it too. So we're not like getting away from anything by, not using React Router. So open up your terminal. Hit Control-C to kill the client for now. Don't ever kill the client. Just kill the client. It's bad for business. Yeah. All right, we're going to do yarn if you have yarn, npm if you have npm. If you have npm, you're going to type install. If you have yarn, you're going to type add. And you're going to add hook router. It's all one word. If you have npm, you're going to type npm install hook router. Hit enter. It's going to reach out, grab the packages, install it, add it to our package.json file or our React or our yarn.log. Just happened to get on the right node, I guess, the internet node. Happens.
The fact that you said that, I say it just because I'm the Mac.
No, it has nothing to do with your operating system. Well, it could have to do with your network card, though. My network card might just be superior, and yours is inferior.
You are running a Mac, probably.
That's what he told me not to say. All right, so now you should have hook router. That's totally cool. Let's go ahead and start our client back up. So yarn start or npm start. Nothing should break. Everything should still be fine because we aren't actually importing this anywhere. So, all right, let's write our main nav. And just before I move on, anybody still writing the router.js file out? No? Okay, cool. Let's go main nav. Partials main nav.js. All right, this is a component, so we obviously need to import
Yeah.
React.
From.
Do you see what I did there, though? I made you react.
That was funny.
All right.
All your jokes, that was funny.
Good to know. All right, we're going to use a bit of destructuring, and we're going to import the A module from hook router. So what this syntax means, hook router. What this syntax means is hook router is like a class or it's a prototypal function, and it has other methods inside of it. We can actually get away with importing only one of those methods and not necessarily the whole bloody library, right? So the way we do that is we put curly braces and we call the method, like the module that we want to actually export. And in this scenario, it happens to be called A. We can't call it whatever we want. We have to call it whatever it's named in that file. That's the only downfall to destructuring. But this makes it easier because then we're not loading in the entire library, right? And the benefit to this is when we actually go to build our application, Webpack will take a look at that and say, oh, well, you only need the A module from hook router. There's no reason for me to load every module from hook router. So it only applies those and adds them to our JavaScript file that it creates, which means you get a lot more optimization. So you have to be a little smart sometimes when you're actually loading these things in and not necessarily just blanket bomb the whole bloody library and when you don't need the whole library. Just take the pieces you need.
How do you know, like, what's in
Documentation. Yeah, if you're not sure what's in there, you go look at the documentation for hook router, and that's how you figure it out, right? Touche, he says. All right, next piece, obviously the function, which will be called main nav. Right, and then we might as well write the export while we're at it, so those pieces are all done. And then we will write the inner guts. Actually, we're going to copy and paste the inner guts. Do you want to write it out?
not this thing?
Are you sure?
Yeah.
It's only like 7 lines of 2,000 characters. We can write it out. I think people want to leave early. All right, if you open up your lesson plan and scroll to where we actually do the nav part, which is right here, what I would like you to do is copy from return to the closing parentheses with semicolon and hit Command-C, and then we'll talk about that. Actually, we will type the center part out, but we'll delete it. So go ahead and copy that. Jump back to your Visual Studio Code, and you're going to put it in between the curly braces and paste it, and hit save. And if you have an annoying linter like I do, it's going to split everything up and make it really kind of annoying. I'll Command B so you can see that a little better. All right. We don't really need to pay much attention to this part. This is just a regular nav. This is from Bootstrap. This A tag is the brand piece that shows up in the menu. This is our button that will show up whenever our screen shrinks too small and we'll wind up in mobile vision. That's what actually produces that little button. So all that is not very necessary. This is the stuff that we want to talk about, this stuff in between these ULs. So what I would like you to do is take from the closing LI to the opening LI at the top and delete that out and hit save, because we're going to type them out. What?
Now that you said that, I'm gonna do it.
It's totally up to you. If you don't want to do it, then don't do it. I don't care. I'm going to type it out. All right. What happens with my linter is it turns this into a self-closing tag. I don't want a self-closing tag. I want a pattern closing tag, or whatever you call it. The opposite to a self-closing tag, a non-self-closing tag. And I'm going to type out our first li. We'll duplicate them anyways, so it's not a big deal, but I want to explain it as we go. The first piece we need is the li that adds the list item. This is just Bootstrap stuff and not anything to do with hook router. So it's nav item, and then I'm going to close that. So the library we required at the top, that wonderful A tag up here at the top from hook router, what it actually is a replacement component for the anchor tag. It works a little differently than the way the anchor tag does naturally. What it does for us, instead of reaching out and actually making a full HTTP request for the content, it will actually take the content, load it in dynamically, silently, lazy load it. It will cache it, which is super awesome, and then deliver it to the end user. Which means as they click through to different things, it will get faster the second time around because it will already be cached and all ready to go, and it'll just be a super fast experience for them on each click after that point. So Hook Router does some really cool stuff for us. In order to use it, we use it like we use any anchor tag. There's no difference. We just do A, but it's capital A, right, with a closing A. That's kind of weird, eh?
Using the A's calling the bolt thing?
Yep. Yep. It's calling the A module from Hook Router. Yeah. We're going to add a class name in here. It's just the Bootstrap class name for navlink. That makes it look pretty. Our href needs to be the route that we want to use, so it's going to be slash because it's the route, it's the root route that we're using. And then just like you would with any anchor tag, you put the text for the anchor tag between the two tags, the opening and closing tag. So this will be home. I'm going to duplicate that twice. I'm going to change the second one to /about and change the label to about. And the last one to contact and change the label to contact. Yes, a boot. I read an article the other day about the Canadian accent and whether or not the world finds the Canadian accent attractive. We're 10. We're in the top 10. I was like, that's impressive.
You know what though? Like all my life, I heard people like making fun of the Canadian accent.
Yeah.
I never actually heard it until I actually went to Calgary.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
So places like Calgary, Newfoundland, and like out east, they're A's. Their A's are super weird. They don't say A the way we do. They say A slightly different. It's got a weird kind of. I can't describe it. You'd have to hear it. It's just slightly different than the way we say it. But Newfoundland, that's the Canadian accent that most people hear where they say a boot and a bye and stuff like that, right? Like nobody really talks like that in Ontario. We sound very Americanized in Ontario. Yeah. We have such a heavy influence from the States here. That's why. All right, so that's our 3 routes right now. And this is the first time we're actually using the hook router. So like I said, that is going to deliver the content to us in a nice cached way. We don't have to worry about other requests happening. It will actually just facilitate us receiving the cache results or the content. Cool. We're going to save it. Mine's going to split up. That's why I was waiting for you to complete it, because otherwise it gets annoying because it's kind of hard to read when it's all split up. All right, anybody still typing out of curiosity before I move on? What's that? Missing what button? Yeah? You should have button. You would have copied it from the page. I copied the same stuff.
It's on one big long line. The first line, it says map, has a button on it.
Yeah.
Just way off your screen.
It's off the screen. You kind of just have to copy all the way over. I'm sorry. That's how it gets delivered on that thing. Yeah. I mean, I could build the app better. But I don't know how to get it to wrap auto. I'd have to implement a new library. Anyways, that's totally off topic. All right, the last step, literally the last step, and we're done, which means we'll be ending like 10 minutes early today, which is a total surprise for me. Let's go to the app.js file. We need the app.js file now. So this is our composer. It's going to compose all of our components together and then export them out, which will now import into index when we're done. So we're going to import React, right? Just like we do with any component. We need to import a module from the hook router called useRoutes. So we're going to import useRoutes, and we're using that destructuring thing again. I always love talking over people. That's like my favorite thing in the world. And then I'm going to import routes from /router. What? Routes, not, yeah. I thought you were correct in the way I say routes. My wife's brother used to say roots. It used to annoy the heck out of me. It was a router, because he was in IT. And he would like work on routers all day long, and he'd call them routers. And I'm like, it's not a router. Router is the guy who comes and does the plumbing thing. Router is the thing that facilitates your IT stuff. And then we're going to kind of break this up in an interesting way. We're going to import the nav into here for ourselves so that we have access from it. Partials, because like I said, this is going to be our composition file, not main, nav. My fingers type faster than my brain thinks, I think. So I wind up typing letters that I don't mean to type. And then we're going to export this in a different way, because you can. You can actually export the function all on one line instead of having to write the export statement as a separate statement. Totally up to you how you want to approach that. To do it on one line, it's just export, default, and then the name of the function. So function app, like so. But you just write export default on the same line. We need to import those routes. So we need to import the content from the current route we're on. We do that by doing const route results equals use routes. And what that's going to do is it's going to take our route results, right? So it's going to look at the path that the user typed in. It's going to fetch that content. It's going to deliver it to us and put it in that route results variable we just created. And then we can spit it out on the page. Last, we're going to return. And inside our return, we're going to do a div. Give it a class name of app. You don't have to, that's completely optional, but I did it for some reason, don't remember why. We're going to add the main nav here, might as well. And then we have to use interpolation to spit out the results in this route because we are in HTML. Remember how I said that before? Once we're in HTML, we have to use interpolation to do any JavaScript expressions. Interpolation is not $ curly braces like it is in regular JavaScript. It's just curly braces. That's it. Some people call them mustaches. Totally up to you if you want to call them mustache or curly braces. I understand both. One last piece left. If you navigate to your app and take a look at it, you're going to notice that all it does right now is say the adventures of a lifetime. There's no menu. There's nothing available to you yet, right? And the reason is because we are still just loading that same page. We haven't changed anything. In order to do this, we need to make sure that app.js is getting loaded in what file? Index, exactly, index.js, because index.js is the one responsible for actually delivering it. So I'm curious, what changes do I need to make here? Yep, exactly. Exactly. So go where it says here, and we're going to change that to app. From components pages home to app. And then last but not least, your render to app, and save it. So this statement is now this, whereas before it was import home. It now needs to be import app from ./components/app.
Now I noticed in your lesson plan you used the function for .js. That's what the function has. No, never mind. I'm being philosophy.
It's fine. This is missing from that, though. I just realized. I need to add it in. And then the last piece is React DOM.render. And make sure you put your app component in there instead of the home component. Okay? And if everything is good, hunky-dory, golden pony boy, open up your Chrome, and you'll notice everything is beautiful. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed this as we've been going along, but we have not refreshed our browsers once. The second you make a change in your code, it gets reflected in the browser. The convenience of that, you can see, this is why this is a front-end framework, because if I'm a designer and I'm going through and I'm designing all this stuff, or I'm a front-end developer and I'm going through and trying to place things, this is super fast for me because I don't need to refresh my browser. I put my browser on one monitor, I stick my code here, I make changes and just glance over, right? So now I'm running very efficiently because I never need to interact with the stupid browser because it's just updating on its own, right? That makes React as a front-end development tool super fast. Add that to the fact that you have components and reusable like pieces, almost like wrapping visual things in functions, right? Because of that, that also now makes it faster for me as a front-end developer. If your goal out of school, which may not be, but it may be, is to become a front-end developer at like $70,000, $80,000 a year to start, upwards of $120,000, $130,000 a year after senior status. If you want to make that kind of money, learn React. It'll pay you all day long, right? JavaScript in general will pay you all day long. You will never not have a job, okay? But yeah, you can see the benefits of React. All right, that's it. That's all I have. It's 6:24, so we're like 15, 20 minutes early. Those of you that have broken applications, I will help you. Otherwise, you are welcome to go. That's it.